All right, welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something that might sound a little, well, abstract at first, but trust me, it gets really interesting. We're going to be talking about the difference between types and tokens.
Ah, yes, types and tokens. This is one of those fundamental distinctions in metaphysics, and it has these really fascinating implications for, well, pretty much how we understand everything. And I think, especially for you, as a philosopher, someone who really thinks about these big questions about categorization, about the nature of reality, this is going to be a really rich topic for us to dive into.
So let's start with maybe a simple, intuitive way to think about it. Imagine a type as a sort of blueprint. It's the general category, the concept itself. And then a token is a specific instance of that type, the actual thing out there in the world.
Exactly. So think about it like, you have a blueprint for a house, right? The blueprint itself, that's the type. But then you can build multiple houses from that same blueprint. Each individual house would be a token of that type.
Right, so there's only one blueprint, but there can be many, many houses.
Exactly. And a really classic example of this comes from a line by Gertrude Stein. She wrote, "Rose is a rose is a rose is a rose." Now, how many words are in that sentence?
Well, it depends on how you count, right?
Exactly. If you're counting the types, the unique words, there are only three. Rose is and a. But if you're counting every single word as it appears, every token, then you get 10 words in total.
Ah, okay, so three types, 10 tokens.
Precisely. And this terminology, type and token, actually comes from the philosopher C.S. Peirce. He was really interested in this distinction.
And it's a distinction that matters because it gets at something really fundamental about, I guess, how things exist in the world.
Absolutely. So a type, we generally think of it as being abstract, right? It's not a physical thing. There's only one type of the word rose, for example, and it doesn't exist in any specific place.
It's like the idea, the concept of a rose.
Right. But a token is a particular instance of that type. It exists in space and time.
Mm-hmm.
So if you write the word rose on a piece of paper, that ink on the paper, that's a token. If you say the word rose out loud, the sound waves that you produce, those are tokens.
So it could even be the pixels on a screen if you're reading the word rose on your computer.
Exactly. Any physical manifestation of that word, that's a token. And this distinction between types and tokens, it isn't just some kind of abstract philosophical game. It actually has real-world implications. I mean,
Yeah.
think about it. Let's say you have a pediatrician who's evaluating a young child's language skills,
Right.
and they say, oh, this child knows 200 words.
You would immediately want to ask 200 word types or 200 word tokens.
Precisely. Because if a 2-year-old knows 200 different word types, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
But if they're just repeating the same few words over and over again, that's a different story.
Right. Like mama dada, ball, ball, ball. That would be a lot of tokens, but not many types.
Exactly. And this also reminds me of something you mentioned earlier. You were talking about a headline you saw that said something like, ancient bean discovered.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And my first thought, I have to admit, as a philosopher was, wait, are they talking about a specific bean, an individual bean that somehow survived for thousands of years? Or are they talking about a type of bean, like a species of bean that's been around for that long?
That's a great point. And that's a perfect example of how the type token distinction can even shape how we interpret claims about the world. It's a really powerful tool for clarifying what we mean.
And there's another important point to bring up here, which is that the type token distinction is not the same thing as the distinction between a type and its occurrences.
Oh, that's a really important point. It can get a little tricky, but it's a crucial distinction, especially when we're thinking philosophically.
Right, so let's go back to that Gertrude Stein quote for a second. Rose is a rose is a rose is a rose. In that sentence, as we said, there are three word types. But if we look at the line itself, the abstract line type, there are 10 occurrences of words, 3 occurrences of a, 3 of is, and 4 of rose.
Exactly. And those are word occurrences, not word tokens.
Hmm?
Because the line type itself, it's an abstract thing. It doesn't exist in space and time, so it can't have physical tokens.
Right, so every token is an occurrence of a type, but not every occurrence is a token.
You got it. And that distinction becomes really important when we start thinking about things like abstract entities, like mathematical objects or concepts. How are they instantiated? Are there tokens of abstract entities? Those are big questions.
So we've got types and tokens, and now we have this idea of occurrences, which are a little bit different. But what I'm really curious about is why does this seemingly simple distinction between type and token matter so much? Where does it show up in our thinking about the world?
Well, I think you'll be surprised by just how pervasive this distinction really is. It pops up everywhere. In linguistics, of course, it's absolutely central. I mean, the whole field is built on this idea of types and tokens.
Right. When linguists talk about the vocabulary of a language or the sounds of a language, they're really talking about types.
Precisely. They're quantifying over types. They'll say things like, English has about 44 phonemes. Now, a phone, that's a type, is an abstract unit of sound, but every time someone speaks, they produce slightly different versions, tokens, of those phones.
And the same goes for words, right? Like if you look up the word color in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, it'll give you all these different spellings, color, color, and so on. But those are all just variations, tokens of the same word type, color.
Exactly. And it gets even more interesting when you start thinking about, different pronunciations of the same word.
Yeah.
Like, take the word schedule, for example.
Hmm.
In American English, we tend to pronounce it with a skilk sound at the beginning. But in British English, it's often pronounced with a sh sound. Same word type, different pronunciations, different tokens.
So the type is like this underlying structure, this blueprint, and the tokens are the actual physical manifestations of that type in the world.
Precisely. And linguists study all sorts of linguistic types. Words, phones, sentences, grammatical structures. And they use those types to build theories about how language works, how we understand each other, how we learn language. So this seemingly simple distinction between type and token, it really underpins the whole field of linguistics.
And they often define one type in terms of other types. So a sentence type is composed of word types, and word types are composed of phone types. It all sort of builds upon each other.
Right. It's a really intricate system, this web of linguistic types. And it's a system that we use every day, even if we don't realize it. But it's also a system that raises all sorts of interesting philosophical questions. I mean, some linguists have argued that the whole idea of linguistic types is just a convenient fiction.
Oh, really? They don't think types actually exist.
Well, it's a debate. I mean, Hutton, for example, he argues that relying on this type token distinction without really thinking about it can lead to some problems. He suggests that maybe linguists need to rethink some of their basic assumptions about what they're studying.
Interesting. So even within linguistics, the type token distinction can be a bit controversial.
Exactly. It's one of those things that seems really simple on the surface, but then when you start digging deeper, it gets pretty complex.
So beyond linguistics, where else do we see this type token distinction making a difference?
Well, as you might imagine, it shows up all over philosophy. In the philosophy of language, for example, it's essential for understanding how abstract meanings relate to specific utterances.
Right, so there's the meaning of a sentence type, like the grammatical structure and the basic semantic content, but then there's the actual meaning a speaker intends to convey when they utter a particular sentence token.
Exactly. And the philosopher H.P. Grice, he did a lot of work on this, on how context and speaker intentions shape the meaning of utterances.
It's like the difference between saying, it's cold in here, as a statement of fact, versus saying it with a certain tone of voice that implies, hey, would you mind closing the window?
Precisely. So the type token distinction helps us make sense of that. And then in the philosophy of mind, the type token distinction leads to some really interesting different views on how mental states relate to physical states in the brain.
Yeah, I was reading about type identity theory and token identity theory. That seemed like a pretty deep rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. So type identity theory, it basically says that every type of mental state is identical to a type of brain state. Like pain, for example, would always be associated with the firing of certain C fibers in the brain.
So no matter who's experiencing the pain or how they're experiencing it, it would always be the same type of physical process happening in the brain.
Exactly. But then token identity theory, it says that every individual instance, every token of a mental state is identical to some physical state or other, but it doesn't have to be the same type of physical state every time.
So two people could be experiencing pain, and it could be caused by different things happening in their brains.
Precisely. Or you could even imagine, an alien or a robot feeling pain, and it wouldn't necessarily involve C fibers at all because their physical makeup is different.
So the type token distinction allows for more flexibility in how we think about the relationship between mind and body.
Right. It opens up a lot of possibilities. And then in aesthetics, the philosophy of art, the type token distinction helps us understand the difference between an artwork itself, which is often seen as a type, and the various physical instances, the tokens of that artwork.
Like, you could have the original Mona Lisa, that would be a unique token, but then you could have countless reproductions, prints, posters, whatever, all of which would be tokens of that same Mona Lisa type.
Exactly. Or think about a sculpture that's cast from a mold. You can make multiple copies, multiple tokens of that same sculpture type.
Or a musical performance like Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. It's been performed thousands of times, each performance a unique token of the same symphony type.
Precisely. So, again, in this distinction between type and token, it's really helping us to understand how things exist in the world. In this case, how artworks exist.
And it's not just art, we see it in ethics too. Like our moral judgments about action types or action tokens. Is lying always wrong as a type of action? Or does it depend on the specific circumstances, the specific token of lying?
Right. So thinkers like Kant, with his emphasis on universalizability, would say that moral rules apply to action types. But then you have folks like Mill, who focus more on the consequences of actions in specific situations, and they might be more inclined to say that morality is really about judging individual action tokens.
That's a really interesting point. And it seems like this type token distinction is so fundamental that it even pops up in our everyday language outside of these more formal philosophical contexts.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere. Think about it. When we talk about a species of animal, like the spirit bear, for example, we're talking about a type.
Right. It's not that every individual spirit bear is rare, it's that the spirit bear as a type is a rare subspecies of bear.
Exactly. Or when scientists talk about a certain type of gene mutation or a type of elementary particle, they're using this distinction. Even when we say something like all men carry the same Y chromosome, we're referring to a specific type of chromosome.
It really is everywhere once you start looking for it.
It is. It's like this underlying framework that we use to understand the world. We categorize things, we group things together, and we use types to do that.
So we've established that this type token distinction is a pretty big deal. It shows up everywhere, from philosophy to science to everyday life. But now let's get back to the really philosophical question. What are types? I mean, what is their nature? Are they like those classic universals like redness or roundness?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it's one that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries. The most common intuition is that types are indeed a kind of universal. They have instances, the tokens, they're repeatable across different instances, and they seem to exist in a way that's independent of any particular token.
Right, they seem abstract.
Exactly. But are they abstract in the same way that a property like redness is abstract? That's where things get a little more complicated. Some philosophers, the hardcore Platonists, they would say that types exist in this separate eternal realm of forms, like Plato's forms.
So they're totally separate from the physical world?
Right. But others would argue that types are somehow immanent in their tokens. They're not completely separate. But there are problems with both views. I mean, if types are totally separate, how do we ever come to know them?
Right, we only ever experience tokens.
Exactly. And if types are immanent in their tokens, how can you have a type without any tokens? Like, what about a word that's never been spoken or written? Does the type still exist?
So there are problems with both views. And it gets even more complicated when you consider how we talk about types. We often refer to them with singular terms like the word justice or the species Homo sapiens. But with classic universals like redness, we usually use predicates. That apple is red.
That's a great point. And that suggests that maybe types are more like objects in a way than they are like properties.
Interesting. So if types aren't just straightforward universals, then what are they? What are some of the other theories out there?
Well, there are a lot of different ideas floating around. Some philosophers have tried to define types in terms of sets. Like they say a type is just the set of all its tokens.
That seems simple enough.
It does, doesn't it? But it runs into some problems.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what about a type that has no tokens? Like that word that's never been spoken or written, would it be an empty set? But then wouldn't all those types with no tokens be the same type? Because they're all empty sets.
Right, and sets are defined by their members. If two sets have the same members, they're the same set. But two types could be different even if they have the same tokens or even if they have no tokens at all.
Exactly. So the set theory approach doesn't quite work. Another approach is to define types as kinds. The philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff, he's a big proponent of this view, he sees kinds as a kind of universal, but they're not just sets. He thinks they have this special relationship to their instances.
So it's not just about membership in a set, it's about being an example of a kind.
Right. And there are different theories about what it means to be an example of a kind. Some philosophers think it's about sharing certain properties, others think it's about having a certain causal history, and so on.
And then there's Charles Peirce's view, which is always interesting. He was the one who came up with the terms type and token, and he saw types as a kind of law.
Yes, Peirce. He was always coming up with these unique ideas. So he saw types as legisigns, which are like general signs that determine how things can exist, how they can be interpreted. But they don't exist in the same way that tokens exist. It's like a rule or a principle.
So for him, a word type wouldn't be the set of all its tokens. It would be the rule that governs how those tokens can be used, how they can be understood.
Exactly. That's like the grammar of a language. The grammar doesn't exist as a physical thing, but it determines how we can put words together to make meaningful sentences.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. So we've got all these different theories about what types are sets, kinds, laws, but I'm also curious about specific types, like what is a word? We've been talking about words this whole time, but how do we actually define what a word is?
That's a great question. And it's a question that linguists have spent a lot of time thinking about. You would think it'd be pretty straightforward, right? We use words all the time. But it turns out that defining word is surprisingly difficult.
What makes it so difficult?
Well, there are all sorts of different criteria we could use. We could define a word based on its spelling, but then what about spoken words? We could define it based on its sound, but then what about homophones? Words that sound the same but have different meaning.
Like two, and two.
Exactly. And then we can define it based on its meaning, but then what about words that have multiple meanings?
Like bank, you could be talking about a financial institution or the edge of a river.
Right. And then there's the question of grammar. Different words have different grammatical functions. Nouns, verbs, adjectives, and so on.
So it seems like there's no single, easy answer to the question of what a word is.
There isn't. It depends on what criteria we prioritize. And this gets back to the type token distinction. I mean, when we're talking about defining word, are we talking about defining the word type or the word token?
Right, because a word type could be defined in a different way than a word token.
Exactly. And a lot of the debate around defining word comes down to this type token distinction. But one thing that's clear is that any adequate theory of words has to account for this complexity. It has to explain how we distinguish one word from another, what properties words have, how we come to know and understand words, and how word types relate to their tokens.
And what about the properties of types? I mean, we've talked about how types can have properties, like a word having a certain spelling or a certain pronunciation. But how do those properties relate to the properties of the tokens?
That's a really important question. And it gets to the heart of the relationship between types and tokens. The traditional view, the Platonic view, is that types exist independently of their tokens, and they have their properties intrinsically. So the word type cat has the property of being spelled C-A-T, regardless of whether anyone ever actually writes or speaks the word.
So the type has the property, and the tokens inherit that property.
Right. But then there's the Aristotelian view, which says that types are somehow immanent in their tokens. They don't exist independently. So the properties of the type are somehow determined by the properties of the tokens. But, as we've seen, there are problems with both views.
Like, how can a type have a property if there are no tokens to instantiate that property?
Exactly. And if the properties of the type are just based on the properties of the tokens, what happens if the tokens are all different? Like, what if everyone pronounces the word cat slightly differently?
Right. So it seems like the relationship between the properties of types and the properties of tokens is pretty complex. And there are a lot of different views on how it works, but it's definitely something that philosophers are still thinking about and debating.
It is. It's a really fundamental question. And it ties into a lot of other big philosophical questions about the nature of reality, about how we know things, and about how language works.
Okay, so we've talked about types, but what about tokens? Are they less philosophically problematic since they're the concrete things out there in the world?
You'd think so, right? I mean, they seem pretty straightforward. But even tokens can get pretty tricky when you start thinking about them philosophically.
Really? How so?
Well, for one thing, how do we identify a token? Like, what makes this particular scribble on this piece of paper a token of the letter A? Is it just its shape? But then, what about different fonts?
Or handwriting, where the shape of the A can vary a lot.
Exactly. And then there are cases where a token might not even be a physical object. Like, imagine you cut the letter A out of a piece of paper. The hole that's left behind, is that a token of the letter A?
That's a really interesting question. It seems like it should be, but it's just empty space.
Right. And then there's the question of mental tokens. Like, if you compose a poem in your head before you write it down, is that poem a token of a poem type?
That's tricky, because it's not a physical thing yet.
Precisely. So even though tokens seem pretty simple at first, there are all sorts of interesting philosophical questions we can ask about them.
I see that. So we've really dug into the nature of types and tokens, but I have to ask the really big question now. Do types actually exist? I mean, are they real things? Or are they just convenient fictions that we use to organize our thoughts?
Ah, the big one. That's the ultimate metaphysical question, isn't it? And it's one that's been debated for as long as philosophy has been around.
And it seems like there's no easy answer.
There really isn't. There are strong arguments on both sides. The realists, they point to the fact that we talk about types all the time in all sorts of different contexts. We quantify over them, we make claims about them, we build theories around them. So they say, look, if types didn't exist, how could we do all that?
Right. It would be really weird if we were constantly talking about things that don't actually exist. Like, imagine if we were having a conversation about unicorns and we were talking about their different breeds and their magical powers and so on, but then someone said, oh, by the way, unicorns don't exist.
Exactly. You feel like we were wasting our time. So the realists say that our language and our practices commit us to the existence of types. But then the nominalists, they say, hold on a minute. We can explain all that type talk without actually positing the existence of types. They say that types are just convenient fictions, useful ways of organizing our thoughts and our language, but they're not real things.
So it's a bit of a standoff.
It is. And there are lots of different versions of nominalism, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Some nominalists try to reduce types to sets of tokens, but as we saw earlier, that runs into some problems. Others try to paraphrase away type talk altogether, but that can get really awkward and convoluted. So it's an ongoing debate.
It sounds like it. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the type token distinction from all sorts of different angles.
We have. It's been a real deep dive.
It has. We've talked about the nature of types and tokens, how they relate to each other, their properties, the different theories about what they are, and even the question of whether they exist at all.
And I think we've raised some really interesting questions for our listeners to ponder.
Definitely. So here's a final thought for you to chew on. Given the difficulty of defining type, and given the challenges faced by the nominalists, how does our reliance on categorization in general terms shape our understanding of reality? Does the type token distinction point to a fundamental tension between the abstract and the concrete, a tension that we grapple with in both our philosophical and everyday thinking?
Those are great questions.
And with that, we'll leave you to ponder those questions. Until next time, keep exploring the depths.